They laughed at my coat before they even buried my husband. I heard the whisper the moment I stepped through the chapel doors, and although the words were spoken quietly, the cruelty behind them traveled clearly across the room, because humiliation never needs volume to make itself known. And for a second, I simply stood there holding the sleeve of my old wool coat tighter against my hands while dozens of eyes moved over me with thinly disguised judgment. And I understood immediately what they saw. Not a grieving widow, but an aging woman dressed too simply. For a family this wealthy, a woman who no longer looked like she belonged beside polished marble floors, expensive floral arrangements, and tailored black suits. And near the front of the chapel, Melissa Carter turned slowly toward me with the controlled smile she wore whenever she wanted to appear kind in front of other people while still making sure I understood my place. And beside her, my son Daniel adjusted his tie nervously, pretending not to notice the tension spreading through the room even though everyone else clearly did. And I walked quietly toward the back rows, choosing not to sit near the family, because grief already felt heavy enough without fighting for space among people who had started treating me like an outsider before the funeral even began. And as I passed a group of relatives, one woman lowered her voice just enough to make certain I could still hear her, asking whether I even owned anything nicer to wear to a millionaire's funeral, and another answered with a soft laugh, saying perhaps all the money disappeared once the marriage papers were signed. And several people smiled behind lowered coffee cups while pretending sympathy. And still I said nothing, because there are moments when silence protects dignity better than anger ever could. And I slowly removed my gloves before sitting alone near the last pew beneath a tall stained glass window where cold gray light spilled across the floor. And for a brief moment I looked down at the coat resting across my lap, remembering the winter evening Richard gave it to me nearly 15 years earlier after I mentioned how warm the lining felt in a small shop outside Boston during our first trip together as husband and wife. And although he could have bought me anything, he always loved that coat, because according to him it looked honest. And the memory tightened painfully inside my chest, because while everyone else in that chapel measured value through appearance, Richard had spent years teaching me the opposite. And at the front of the room, Melissa continued greeting guests confidently, moving through conversations like the future owner of everything my husband built, while Daniel followed beside her, emotionally exhausted and distracted. And more than once I noticed Melissa glancing toward me before whispering something into another relative's ear, causing restrained smiles to spread through the crowd. And eventually she crossed the aisle toward me, carrying herself with polished confidence, before stopping beside my pew and looking directly at the coat folded across my knees. And with a soft laugh, she asked whether I truly thought Richard would have wanted me attending his funeral dressed like someone walking out of a thrift store. And even though her tone sounded light enough for plausible deniability, the insult landed exactly as intended, because several nearby relatives immediately turned toward us, pretending not to listen while waiting for my reaction. And I looked up at her, calmly refusing to give the emotional scene she clearly expected from me. And after several seconds, I simply answered that grief does not care how expensive fabric looks. And Melissa smiled thinly before replying that appearances still matter in families like this. And as she walked away again, I noticed a man standing quietly near the chapel entrance, watching the exchange with unusual attention. A gray-haired attorney holding a dark red folder tightly beneath one arm. And unlike everyone else in that room, his expression carried no judgment at all, only patience, as though he already knew something the rest of the family did not. The funeral service began beneath soft organ music and carefully practiced sorrow, but even as the pastor spoke about loyalty, love, and lifelong devotion, I could still feel the judgment circling quietly around me, like cold air moving through the chapel. And every time someone glanced toward the old coat folded neatly across my lap, I saw the same silent conclusion forming behind their eyes. That Richard's widow looked far too ordinary for the wealth attached to his name. And near the front rows, Melissa continued moving confidently between relatives, greeting guests, directing flower deliveries, and speaking with the funeral coordinator as though she had already stepped into the role of family matriarch before Richard was even laid to rest. And Daniel followed her from conversation to conversation, looking emotionally drained and distracted while avoiding eye contact with me almost entirely. And that hurt more deeply than Melissa's insults, because distance from strangers is expected during grief, but distance from your own child settles into the heart differently. And I sat quietly near the back, listening to whispers drift through the room in fragments sharp enough to wound despite their careful softness. Comments about the estate, the mansion, the investments, and whether Richard had been foolish enough to leave significant control to someone so unprepared for this kind of life. And although no one spoke directly to me anymore, I understood perfectly that I remained the center of every conversation. And for a moment, I closed my eyes, trying to focus only on Richard's voice instead of the people surrounding me. Because throughout our marriage, he always warned me that wealth changes how relatives behave long before money actually changes hands. And I used to laugh whenever he said it, believing family loyalty mattered more than inheritance discussions. But sitting inside that chapel, I finally understood how quickly grief can become secondary once people begin imagining ownership. And eventually the pastor invited family members forward to share memories, and Melissa immediately stood gracefully, smoothing the sleeves of her expensive black coat before walking toward the podium with practiced confidence. And she spoke warmly about Richard's business success, his discipline, and the legacy he built for future generations, while carefully presenting herself as the person most prepared to continue protecting everything he created. And several relatives nodded proudly during her speech, while I remained still near the back pew, listening carefully, because beneath every compliment she offered existed another quieter message, that she believed the future of this family belonged entirely to people like her now. And after she finished speaking, Daniel approached the podium next, but his voice lacked certainty, and more than once he paused, searching for words while staring down at the folded paper, trembling slightly in his hands. And when he finally looked toward me across the chapel, I saw guilt flicker briefly across his face before disappearing again beneath exhaustion. And after the service ended, guests slowly rose from their seats, gathering near the front entrance, discussing lunch plans and estate matters with increasing openness now that formal prayers had concluded. And I remained seated alone for several extra minutes, because I needed time to gather myself emotionally before facing another room full of whispered assumptions. And that was when the gray-haired attorney I noticed earlier quietly approached my pew, carrying the same dark red folder beneath his arm. And unlike everyone else, he looked directly at me without hesitation before introducing himself as Walter Green, Richard's estate attorney. And when he asked softly whether I was managing all right, there was genuine respect in his voice instead of pity or suspicion. And I answered politely that grief leaves very little room for anything else. And he nodded slowly before glancing toward the crowd surrounding Melissa near the chapel doors, and after a long pause he lowered his voice just enough to avoid being overheard before saying Richard specifically requested a private family meeting at the estate later that evening and insisted that I attend no matter what anyone else expected. And then Walter added one final sentence while resting his hand lightly against the red folder. Your husband prepared more carefully than they realize. The drive from the chapel to the Carter estate felt strangely quiet despite the number of people traveling there, because grief had already started transforming into something else entirely, something colder and more calculating, hidden beneath polite conversation and practiced sympathy. And I sat alone in the back seat of the family car, watching gray winter clouds gather above the city, while Daniel focused silently on the road, and Melissa scrolled through messages on her phone beside him as though the funeral had become another exhausting obligation she was ready to finish managing. And several times I noticed her glancing toward my coat folded carefully across my lap, before quickly looking away again, with faint disapproval still lingering behind her expression. And for a moment, I wondered if she realized how much energy she wasted judging appearances while completely misunderstanding the people beneath them. And when we finally arrived at the estate, relatives were already Gathering inside the large sitting room, balancing coffee cups and quiet expectations, while expensive artwork and polished wooden walls reflected the fading evening light, and the house no longer felt like home to me in that moment, because every conversation seemed centered around ownership rather than loss. And I overheard one cousin quietly asking whether the mansion would eventually be sold, while another speculated about the future of Richard's investment properties before his funeral flowers had even begun to wilt. And near the fireplace, Melissa stood confidently speaking with several relatives about maintaining family standards and preserving the estate properly now that serious decisions would need to be made. And although she never used my name directly, every sentence carried the same implication, that I represented a temporary emotional complication standing in the way of the future she already imagined for herself and Daniel. And I quietly removed my gloves while sitting near the tall windows where Richard once spent evenings reviewing financial reports beside the fire, and the memory struck painfully, because while everyone else now measured his life through property and inheritance, I still remembered the ordinary details no one else noticed. The way he hummed softly while reading newspapers, the way he hated sleeping with the television on, and the way he always reached for my hand during difficult conversations, even after decades together. And eventually Walter Green entered the room carrying the same dark red folder beneath one arm, and the atmosphere shifted almost immediately because every person there understood something important was about to happen, and conversations softened while relatives slowly gathered around the seating area, pretending calm interest despite the obvious tension moving through the room. And Melissa sat beside Daniel near the center sofa with polished confidence, crossing one leg carefully over the other while I remained slightly apart near the windows, feeling less like family and more like a witness observing people reveal themselves under pressure. And Walter waited until the room settled completely before explaining that Richard had left several private instructions regarding estate matters and family responsibilities that needed to be addressed immediately according to his written wishes. And the moment he mentioned written wishes, I noticed Melissa straighten slightly, with visible anticipation, while one relative quietly whispered that Richard always rewarded people who understood business properly, and several others nodded subtly, while glancing toward Daniel, as though the future had already been decided before a single document was opened. And I lowered my eyes calmly because I no longer felt surprised by any of it. And then Walter slowly placed the dark red folder on the table before looking directly toward me for only a second, and something about that brief glance caused Melissa's confident expression to tighten almost imperceptibly, as though she suddenly sensed a detail no one else in the room had considered yet. And when Walter finally rested one hand against the folder before speaking again, the entire estate fell completely silent. Walter allowed the silence to settle over the room before opening the dark red folder, and somehow that quiet tension felt heavier than any argument could have, because every person gathered inside the estate already believed they understood exactly how the evening would unfold. And I watched relatives straighten slightly in their seats while Melissa folded her hands together with polished composure beside Daniel, as though she were preparing to receive confirmation of a future she had already privately claimed. And Walter began calmly explaining that Richard spent the final years of his life reorganizing several personal holdings and private assets separately from the public estate structure, due to concerns he developed about how quickly family relationships had begun revolving around appearances, wealth, and social status. And although his tone remained professional, I noticed several relatives exchange uncomfortable glances because deep down everyone understood those concerns. Described the very atmosphere filling the room now. And Walter continued reading from a handwritten statement Richard left behind, explaining that true loyalty often becomes invisible inside wealthy families, because people stop measuring love through sacrifice and begin measuring it through presentation instead. And the moment he said presentation, I instinctively looked down at the old wool coat resting neatly across my lap, while Melissa shifted subtly beside Daniel, avoiding eye contact for the first time that evening, and Walter then explained that Richard wanted his personal words heard before any financial documents were discussed, because according to him, inheritance reveals character more clearly than grief ever does. And the room fell even quieter as Walter unfolded another sheet of paper written entirely in Richard's careful handwriting. And hearing Walter read those words aloud felt strangely intimate, because suddenly Richard's voice seemed to return to the room through every sentence. And in the letter he described long nights spent recovering from illness, moments of fear he never shared publicly, and the quiet consistency of the person who remained beside him through all of it without asking for recognition or reward. And although he never mentioned my name immediately, everyone in the room already understood who he meant, because no one else had been there through those difficult years except me. And I noticed Daniel lower his eyes slowly, while several relatives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs as though memories they preferred ignoring had suddenly become impossible to avoid. And then Walter read the line that changed the atmosphere entirely. The people who judged value through appearance understood my money better than they understood my life. And I felt something tighten painfully inside my chest, because Richard always spoke gently even when telling hard truths. And across the room, Melissa's carefully controlled confidence began cracking in small, visible ways as she crossed her arms tighter against herself, while staring at the floor instead of the rest of the family. And Walter paused briefly before continuing that Richard had transferred ownership of several private estate holdings years earlier under confidential legal protection, specifically because he wanted those properties managed by the one person he believed valued home over status. And immediately I sensed tension move sharply through the room, because for the first time, relatives stopped looking at Daniel like the obvious future owner and started looking toward me instead. And Melissa finally broke the silence, asking whether Walter intended to clarify exactly which holdings Richard transferred and to whom. And although her voice remained calm enough for politeness, I could hear fear beginning to rise beneath it now. And Walter looked directly at her before answering carefully that every transfer had been completed legally and privately according to Richard's direct instructions long before his death. And then after one final pause, he removed a sealed property document from the folder before resting it gently on the table directly in front of me, while the entire room stared in complete silence. For several long seconds, no one inside the estate moved after Walter placed the property document in front of me, because the meaning behind that single gesture reached everyone in the room before a single word of explanation followed it. And I looked down quietly at the sealed papers resting beside my old wool coat, while tension spread visibly through the family gathered around the sitting room. And across from me, Melissa stared at the document with the same disbelief people wear when reality suddenly refuses to match the version of events they already rehearsed inside their minds. And beside her, Daniel leaned forward slowly, as though trying to understand how everything had shifted so dramatically without him noticing it sooner. And Walter finally broke the silence by explaining that several years earlier Richard legally transferred ownership of multiple private estate properties, including the lake house, the investment land outside Aspen, and the original Carter family residence, into a protected holding structure managed solely under my authority. And immediately a quiet wave of shock moved through the room, because everyone there understood exactly what those properties represented financially and symbolically. And one relative actually laughed softly in disbelief before asking whether Richard made those decisions recently, while sick or emotionally vulnerable. And Walter answered firmly that every transfer occurred years before Richard's final illness and had been reviewed repeatedly by independent legal counsel to ensure clarity and permanence. And hearing that seemed to remove the final illusion that this might somehow be temporary or mistaken. And Melissa finally stood from the sofa, unable to remain composed anymore, asking why Richard would hide something this significant from his own family, while placing control in the hands of someone who, according to her, never even looked like she belonged in this world. And although the room became uncomfortably silent, After she said it aloud, no one interrupted her, because deep down several people still shared the same thought even now. And I slowly lifted my eyes toward her, feeling less angry than tired, because throughout the entire day, she had continued confusing elegance with loyalty and appearance with worth. And before I could answer, Walter calmly unfolded another handwritten page from Richard, explaining that he intentionally kept the transfers private because he wanted at least one place in his life, protected from the influence of status, competition, and entitlement. And as Walter continued reading, Richard described how the estate stopped feeling like a home whenever conversations centered more around ownership than family, and how the only person who never treated his properties like future prizes was me. And those words settled heavily over the room, because every relative there suddenly remembered countless dinners, holidays, and gatherings where money quietly shaped conversations more than love ever did. And Daniel lowered his face into his hands briefly, while Melissa stared toward the fireplace, blinking rapidly, as though trying to maintain control over emotions she no longer fully understood. And for a moment, I remembered the evening Richard first brought me to the old lake house years earlier, when he smiled while watching me walk through the empty rooms, and quietly said this place finally felt peaceful with me inside it. And at the time I thought he was simply being romantic. But now, sitting inside the estate surrounded by silence and exposed greed, I finally understood how deeply he meant it. And Walter eventually closed the document folder before explaining that according to Richard's instructions, no changes to the protected holdings could be contested or altered after his death, because every legal safeguard had already been completed long ago. And the atmosphere inside the room shifted completely after that, because the family no longer saw me as a temporary widow, sitting quietly in an old coat near the windows. They were now forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that Richard trusted me with the parts of his life he valued most long before any of them realized it. No one reached for their coffee after that, because the room no longer felt comfortable enough for ordinary gestures, and even the relatives who spent the entire afternoon whispering confidently about inheritance now sat in unusual silence, avoiding direct eye contact with one another. And I remained near the windows, holding the property documents quietly against my lap, while the old wool coat rested folded beside me, like something suddenly transformed from an object of ridicule into a reminder. None of them fully understood, and across the room Melissa stood motionless beside the fireplace, staring toward Walter as though she still expected another explanation that would somehow restore the version of reality she preferred, but none came. And eventually Daniel rose slowly from the sofa before walking toward the windows where I sat, and for the first time that day, he looked at me not with distance or discomfort, but with visible uncertainty mixed painfully with shame, and he asked quietly why his father never told him about the protected properties, and although his voice remained calm, I could hear the deeper question hidden beneath it: why Richard trusted me with things he never shared, even with his own son. And before I answered, I looked briefly toward the family portraits hanging above the fireplace, remembering years of birthdays, holidays, and dinners, where Richard often seemed emotionally present with me, while increasingly guarded around everyone else in the room. And I finally told Daniel that his father spent years trying to protect peace inside the family, but eventually realized peace becomes impossible once people start valuing assets more than relationships. And hearing that caused Daniel to lower his eyes, because deep down he already knew exactly when those changes began happening inside the family. And Melissa finally stepped forward, then her posture still polished, but noticeably less certain than before, asking whether I planned on selling the estate properties now that they legally belonged to me. And although the question sounded practical on the surface, I understood the fear underneath it, because for the first time all evening, she no longer spoke like someone discussing future plans, but like someone suddenly uncertain about her own place inside them. And I answered honestly that Richard never gave me those homes as trophies or investments, but as places carrying memories he wanted protected from greed and competition. And several relatives shifted uncomfortably after hearing that, because nobody could deny how openly Jari. The snow outside continued falling steadily as the evening grew darker, and one by one distant relatives quietly gathered their coats and left the estate, carrying with them the uncomfortable silence that always follows exposed truth. And the sitting room slowly emptied until only Daniel, Melissa, Walter, and I remained near the fireplace, surrounded by untouched coffee cups, fading firelight, and the emotional weight Richard somehow still managed to place over the room even after death. And for a long time no one spoke, because every conversation now felt dangerous in a different way, not because of legal uncertainty anymore, but because honesty had finally entered the room and none of us seemed fully prepared for it. And Daniel eventually moved toward the liquor cabinet, pouring himself a glass of water instead, before standing near the shelves with his back partially turned, as though struggling to process memories that suddenly looked different now than they had only hours earlier. And I watched him quietly, realizing grief often forces people to confront not only loss, but also the painful realization that they misunderstood the people closest to them, while there was still time to know them better. And Melissa remained seated near the fireplace, her posture noticeably smaller than before, while she stared at the glowing embers without speaking. And eventually she asked softly whether Richard truly believed the family only cared about appearances and wealth. And although the question sounded simple, I understood how much fear lived beneath it, because for the first time all evening she no longer sounded angry. She sounded uncertain about who she had become inside this family herself. And Walter answered before I could, speaking carefully, as he explained that Richard often worried success had slowly transformed family gatherings into performances where everyone competed quietly for importance instead of connection. And hearing those words caused Melissa to close her eyes briefly, because no one there could honestly deny it anymore. And after another long silence, Daniel finally turned toward me, asking whether I had known about the estate transfers the entire time. And I nodded slowly, admitting that Richard told me years ago after one particular family dinner, when he returned home emotionally exhausted by conversations focused entirely on investments, inheritances, and social appearances rather than people themselves. And I remembered how he sat beside me in the kitchen afterwards, still wearing his tie, while quietly saying that he no longer knew whether relatives loved him or simply loved proximity to what he owned. And as I shared that memory, the room grew painfully still, because deep down everyone recognized pieces of themselves inside it. And Melissa finally looked toward me directly, then asking why I never defended myself at the funeral when people mocked my coat, and whispered behind my back. And I lowered my eyes briefly toward the worn fabric resting beside me before answering honestly that Richard spent years teaching me there is no dignity in competing with people determined to misunderstand you. And after hearing that, Melissa's expression shifted in a way I had not seen before, because for the first time since the funeral began, she no longer looked at me like a rival standing between her and the future she wanted. She looked at me like someone finally realizing how much damage pride can cause before truth arrives. And Walter quietly gathered the remaining papers afterward, preparing to leave for the evening. But before reaching the doorway, he paused beside the fireplace and explained that Richard left one final sealed letter intended only for immediate family to be opened the following morning. And the moment he said final letter, tension quietly returned to the room, because despite everything already revealed, everyone understood Richard was not finished speaking yet. And Walter placed the unopened envelope carefully on the table beneath the soft golden light before leaving the estate in silence. And as the front door closed behind him, I looked toward the sealed letter resting beside the fire while snow continued falling beyond the dark windows, and suddenly realized the hardest truths Richard intended to reveal might still be waiting inside that envelope. The estate felt unnaturally quiet after Walter left, as though the entire house itself was waiting for morning to arrive before allowing the final truth to surface. And none of us immediately reached for the sealed envelope resting on the table, because Richard's presence already filled the room heavily enough without opening another piece of his voice too soon. and the fire crackled softly beneath the mantel, while snow continued drifting across the dark property outside the windows, turning the grounds pale silver beneath the night sky. And for a while Daniel stood silently near the bookshelves, staring at old family photographs arranged across the cabinet, while Melissa remained seated near the fireplace, her expression distant and emotionally exhausted in a way I had never seen before. And eventually, she spoke, quietly asking whether Richard and I were truly happy during the final years of his life, because according to her, he often looked withdrawn during family gatherings, and hearing that question unexpectedly softened something inside me, because for the first time all evening, she sounded less interested in money and more interested in understanding the man. Everyone suddenly realized they may not have known nearly as well as they believed. And I answered honestly that Richard became tired near the end, not because he lacked success or comfort, but because he felt increasingly invisible inside conversations centered around status and expectations. And I explained that during our quiet evenings together away from parties and business dinners, he often admitted how lonely wealth can become once people stop seeing the human being behind it. And Daniel slowly sat down after hearing that, his face filled with the kind of regret children carry when they realize too late that their parents spent years silently asking for emotional closeness instead of admiration. And after several moments, he admitted there were countless times Richard invited him fishing at the lake house, or simply asked him to spend weekends away from work, but he almost always declined, believing there would always be more time later. And the sadness in his voice settled heavily over the room, because grief rarely hurts most for the conversations we had. It hurts for the ones we postponed until opportunity disappeared completely. And eventually Melissa looked toward the old coat folded beside me before quietly asking why Richard cared about it so deeply, and I gently brushed my fingers across the worn sleeve before explaining that years ago, during one difficult winter, Richard and I drove through a snowstorm after visiting his father in the hospital, and our car broke down outside a small roadside diner in Vermont. And while waiting hours for help, I gave Richard my coat, because his hands were shaking badly from the cold, even though I knew I would freeze without it myself. And afterward, he kept insisting the coat reminded him that genuine love protects quietly without worrying about appearances or recognition. And when I finished speaking, neither Daniel nor Melissa answered immediately, because for the first time the coat no longer represented poverty, embarrassment, or social failure to them. It represented the kind of loyalty Richard spent years searching for inside a family increasingly distracted by wealth. And eventually midnight approached, and Daniel finally reached toward the sealed envelope with careful hesitation before placing it in front of me instead, saying softly that his father probably intended me to open it first. And my hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal, because despite everything already revealed, part of me still feared hearing Richard's final private thoughts aloud. And inside rested a handwritten letter folded carefully beside a single photograph of Richard and me standing together at the lake house years earlier, both laughing beneath heavy snowfall, while I wore the same old coat everyone mocked only hours ago. And as I stared down at that photograph, a painful realization settled over me quietly but completely. Richard had spent years leaving behind clues about what truly mattered to him, while everyone else remained too distracted by wealth to notice any of them. My hands remained still for several seconds after unfolding Richard's final letter, because suddenly the room no longer felt like an estate filled with inheritance tension and exposed family pride. It felt like the last private conversation between two people who understood each other long before anyone else noticed what mattered. And Daniel and Melissa sat quietly across from me, watching without interruption, while snow continued falling softly outside the windows covering the dark property in silence. And finally, I began reading Richard's words aloud, because somehow keeping them private no longer felt right after everything that had already been revealed. And the first line alone seemed to change the atmosphere inside the room completely. If you are hearing this letter, then the noise surrounding my death has probably become louder than the truth surrounding my life. And Daniel lowered his eyes immediately, while Melissa sat perfectly still beside the fire as I continued reading. And Richard wrote that during his final years, he often watched people admire his success, while overlooking the ordinary moments that actually gave his life meaning. And he explained that wealth attracted attention easily, but loyalty revealed itself quietly through consistency, sacrifice, patience, and presence. And then his words turned personal again as he described the winter night in Vermont when the coat everyone mocked became his clearest memory of unconditional love, because according to him, no expensive gesture ever compared to watching someone willingly stand in freezing snow simply to keep another person warm. And by then my voice had started trembling slightly, because every sentence carried pieces of a marriage built privately rather than performed publicly. And when I looked up briefly, I noticed tears forming in Daniel's eyes for the first time all evening, while Melissa stared silently toward the photograph resting on the table between us, and Richard's letter continued, explaining that he never transferred the hidden estate properties to reward obedience or punish family members, but because he needed at least one part of his legacy protected by someone who understood the difference between ownership and stewardship. And then near the end came the line none of us seemed emotionally prepared for. The woman in that old coat carried more dignity into every room than most people carry in custom suits. And after hearing those words, Melissa slowly covered her mouth with one hand while Daniel leaned back against the sofa staring toward the ceiling as though finally understanding how badly both of them had misjudged not only me, but their father as well. And when I reached the final paragraph, Richard wrote, that families survive not through inheritance, but through humility, because money can maintain estates while only character can maintain relationships. And then came his final sentence. If they mocked the coat, they never truly saw the woman wearing it. And the room remained completely silent after I finished reading, because no defense apology or explanation could compete with the honesty Richard left behind inside those pages. And eventually Melissa stood slowly before walking toward me, with visible hesitation, stopping beside my chair, while tears rested quietly in her eyes. And in a voice almost unrecognizable from the confidence she carried earlier that day, she apologized for judging me so harshly without ever trying to understand me first. And although the pain from the funeral still lingered, I realized bitterness suddenly felt far less important than the exhaustion grief had already placed on all of us. And I simply nodded gently before folding Richard's letter carefully beside the photograph and resting both against the old coat across my lap. And as the firelight flickered softly across the room, I finally understood the real reason Richard protected the hidden estate so carefully. It was never about preserving wealth at all. It was about preserving the memory of who loved him before anyone started calculating what his life might eventually be worth.